The unprecedented pace of disruption and uncertainty makes leadership more relevant today than ever before. It is not position or power, but your leadership skills that help you to think in unique, creative ways. When faced with a crisis, a leader is forced to think and make critical decisions. A leader who empowers a team and gives the employees accountability increases the effectiveness of an organization. John Maxwell says leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. Warren Bennett says leadership is the capacity to turn vision into reality. Bill Gates says, as we look ahead into the next century, leaders will be those who empower others. Today, I have the honor of welcoming Steve Tendon. Steve Tendon is the managing director of Tame Flow Consulting Limited. He is the creator of the Tame Flow approach, a pragmatic systems thinking approach that delivers superior business outcomes in knowledge-intensive digital businesses without compromising sustainability, quality, or humanity. Steve's expertise covers organizational performance, large-scale IT, digital, agile transformations, engineering, knowledge work management, decentralized organizations, organizational design, and more. In his most recent book, Tame Your Workflow, Steve focuses on how to apply the theory of constraints to knowledge work, and in particular, how to handle coordination, synchronization, and prioritization in so-called pest environments, environments where you have multiple projects or products, multiple events or deadlines, multiple stakeholders, and multiple teams. His techniques provide business with agility to change direction at speed and at scale by dramatically improving performance, even in extreme VUCA conditions. Steve is furthermore a world-class expert on blockchain technologies, providing strategic advisory services to startups, multinationals, and governments. He was instrumental in creating Malta's national blockchain strategy and the SOV crypto legal tender of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Welcome to this interview, Steve.
Thank you, Sajeev. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to have this engaging conversation with you.
Yeah, I'd like to begin by asking you, what do you think are 3 traits that a leader or a project manager should have to thrive in a disruptive economy?
As you know, I focus a lot on high-performing organizations, and especially in the context of knowledge work, which today is most businesses. And I have come to define or identify 3 founding patterns that recur over and over again in such organizations. And these patterns are inspired leadership. Notice well, I said inspired, not inspiring. There is an important difference. I will get back to that later. The unity of purpose and the community of trust. These are traits that will help any organization in any situation, even more so when they are facing a crisis. So if we were to map those traits, organizational patterns, to individual traits of people who have to operate and lead and make decisions in these organizations, I would say they correspond to 1, know yourself, 2, know your purpose, and 3, know your people. If you have that in a person, well, that's what it takes.
Very interesting points: inspired leadership, unity of purpose, and community of trust. The second question is about a leader's response in a crisis. How does a leader respond to a crisis situation? What are some parts of that effective response?
So in a situation of crisis, the speed of sensing, responding, and executing is paramount. So the more you have prepared your organization to deal under conditions of stress, and as I say, to gain the agility to change direction at speed and at scale, well, then you are in a good position to handle this. So this is not something you do when the crisis hits you. Then it is too late. Then most likely, if you're not prepared, you will act or react in panic. And most likely, you will make decisions that are not beneficial for the organization as a whole. So this element is important, that leaders, managers, stakeholders have to understand that the best moment to prepare for a crisis is when things are calm and good. If the crisis hits you and you have like drilled your people to communicate, interact, make decisions quickly, swiftly, well, then you're in a position to trust your people to make the right decision at any moment. Because in this world of knowledge work and of VUCA, with lots of volatility, uncertainty, and so on, what becomes critical is not so much the decision-making ability of the leader, but the decision-making ability of anyone who is hit with the problem at that moment. So preparing and nurturing decentralized, distributed decision-making methods, patterns, protocols, habits will allow you as a leader to delegate critical decision-making to the people who are facing the problems in that moment. Of course, this has huge psychological and cultural aspects, because a leader needs to be able to let go. You use the word empowerment, which in a sense captures that element. You need to allow people on the ground to make critical decisions. But as a leader, that requires a good dose of humility, of admitting that you do not know it all, of letting go of the temptation of micromanagement and of following up every single little instance of problems you might have. And this brings me also to another aspect. It's the becoming aware of the limitations of yourself as a top manager or as a leader, but also of the organization as a whole. So all those aspects that pertain to constraints management become relevant. And as a leader, when you have to respond, you must know that you are one of the most limited resources in the organization. And in particular, your attention, management attention, is extremely precious. You must make sure you don't waste that attention. So you must make sure that the people bring you the right information at the right time and not overload you with irrelevant facts. And this has long-reaching consequences. But you see how it connects back to what I said in the first instance, in the first question: know yourself, know your purpose, and know your people.
Nice point about distributed decision making, which I think is not so common, because not many leaders have the humility of empowering everybody in the team. Which brings me to the next question about teamwork. How do you keep, as a leader, your team motivated and connected? And how do you support them during crisis situations?
It's a bit the same concept as before. The team spirit, of course, can emerge during the crisis because you're all hit by greater problems. But it is nurtured before. So it's the fundamental notion of unity of purpose is extremely important. And most organizations, notwithstanding all the declaration of intent and all the mission statements and maybe flashy posters on their walls, have not actually implemented or actualized this notion of unity of purpose. When people share a purpose, the team spirit emerges naturally. It's not something that has to be created or imposed, or as many do, attempted to bring out through activities, team building activities, which in reality are just moments of distraction and entertainment. They might be good for that. Give the people a moment to relax and have fun, but they're not doing much to create this unity of purpose and to develop the team spirit as you said. So the team spirit must be considered as a systemic, ongoing habit, a modus operandi, a way of being, and not as something that you invoke and resort to in the exceptional times of an emergency crisis. It is an ongoing thing. So if you have worked on this before, you will be prepared when the crisis hits.
If you look back at your career, what do you think is one of the big challenges that you have faced as a project manager or as a leader?
Right. Though I have a master's in software project management, nowadays I don't consider myself as a project manager, but as a systems thinker. Of course, I've learned to work with many project managers and projects, but the biggest challenge for me was transitioning from previous modes of thinking to this systems thinking perspective. And one key element in my team flow approach is the definition of mental models. So models that interpret, or we use to interpret, the reality around us. And when transitioning towards systems thinking, there are many pre-existing mental models that you need to let go of, and in particular mental models which are the foundation of the metrics that organizations are collecting. So KPIs, cost accounting, earned value, all these aspects that basically convey information from the ground to the decision makers, and they are expressed numerically for a reason, because the decision maker cannot possibly know all the details, all the facets of the different parts of the organization. So the numbers become like the universal language of management, and managers use numbers to make decisions across the board, notwithstanding the specialities of the different organizational units. But these numbers that normally are used, again, they are not aligned with the idea of creating unity of purpose, community of trust. So in order to arrive there, you must adopt different mental models with different metrics, and in particular numbers that bring people together rather than, as for instance, all the budgeting process that we know, tearing apart the fabric of the society in the organization. Because at the end, with budgeting, all people, all units, they want their slice of the pie. They want to have a bigger slice this coming year than the last year. So it is a structural element that creates conflicts within the organization. So the challenge there, my challenge in this transitioning, was really to let go of all these older mental models and develop and understand the new ones.
Now, in the current scenario, what we are doing is we are using a lot of Zoom, Google Meets, Skype, and then you have WhatsApp, Telegram, and whatnot. So the world is moving from a face-to-face co-located workplace to a virtual workplace. So how do you lead effectively in such a virtual workplace?
Well, that's really a relevant question in these times. And there is no clear-cut answer, because the dynamics of the interaction through a screen and audio is clearly not the same as when you're sitting in a face-to-face meeting, and it is also more stressful for the participants. So the lack of direct face-to-face presence and the like alienating element of the video camera that is always looking at you, you get like the sense of being under the lens of a big brother. And we've all seen on YouTube, you know, the examples of Zoom meetings that, well, turned out to be very entertaining, because all of a sudden you had elements of private life that like photobombed the broadcast. So you have all these elements that you would not have at all in a meeting room. So how do we do this? Well, I would make a clear-cut distinction between the work-related topics and the social interaction elements that you might also want to cultivate. And I would say, first of all, make two distinct meetings, meeting types, those that focus on the work and those that focus on, let's just have a drink and have a conversation. Don't mix them up. Don't mix them up, because it's not working through the video channel. So for the conversational type of meetings, I suggest to take inspiration from habit that is widespread in Sweden, the so-called fika break, where in the morning at a given time and in the afternoon, literally everyone stops working, and on the workplace they go to the coffee room and have coffee and just talk about whatever they want to talk. So it's a moment of socialization. Do that kind of meeting online as well, with no agenda, just freewheeling. Anyone who wants to say something can talk. But then you need to have the actual meetings where work gets done. And here my advice is to try to do as short meetings as possible. You keep them short and focused. And also don't become a slave of the clock and the time box. If you tend to keep the meetings short and focused, most likely they will finish sooner. But at the same time, because you want to have them focused, Be very clear on defining the goal, the outcome, the objective of the meeting. And if you need more time to achieve that objective, again, do not be slave of the clock. The objective is more important. If you need to extend the meeting for another 15 minutes or even an hour because it's needed, and you, with your colleagues in the meeting, agree that that is important, well, do that, because you will gain lots of time that way rather than interrupting, adjourning, and, oh, we have to meet again when? Next week? No, I cannot. And, you know, the whole game starts over for trying to find times. So this means that when you schedule meetings, never put them end to end. Leave lots of buffer time in between. And again, if you focus on doing short and focused meetings, you can afford that. So then the question becomes, how can you do focused meetings? Well, this is where some techniques that I use in TameFlow become very, very useful. Because what I teach is the notion of management by exception. So you don't use meetings on a cadence with regular status reporting. That, by the way, is never working in a VUCA world, because the variability, the uncertain things, Mr. Murphy will call you to action whenever it best suits Mr. Murphy himself, and not when you have scheduled your next reporting session. So one way to deal with this is with management by exception, where you are sensitizing the organization to become aware. Again, we go back to that first element of self-awareness, even collective self-awareness, of becoming aware and constructing the ways of working so that the work itself will generate signals, triggers that you can use to call a meeting. We go in a meeting because there is a reason, not because there is a habit to do it every day or every week at a certain time point. This means that if there is a reason, very often we will have very frequent meetings, even several times per day. But if there is no reason, we are not calling meetings just for the sake of having a meeting. So these work execution signals are very important in the daily operations. But then you must also act in retrospect and learn from what has happened. So that brings us to the reflective sorts of meetings, where you look back, like retrospectives and so on, and you want to figure out what are the lessons we have learned during a certain period. Most retrospectives techniques are extremely dispersive, and most often, if there was something important that happened 2 weeks ago, I don't remember the details. So the remembering is not effective. So what I suggest is that in the daily operations, when you have these work execution signals or other reasons to call an ad hoc management by exception meeting, also be very disciplined and keep reason logs, where you log what was the reason and what were the countermeasures that you took to address that reason. And then when you get to the retrospective, even the retrospective can be extremely focused, because you have this reason log, you have a memory of what happened. And if you structure that log properly, you can also do fancy further elaborations, statistical, like frequency analysis. Is there something that keeps on coming back and we're not able to address? It's like common cause variation. Can we find a root cause for these things and address them once and for all? Of course, if you're not keeping reasons logs, you're not able to do this kind of analysis. And that gives like another dimension to the retrospective, because then you're able to address things that are repeatedly impacting your way of working. So there are many things you can do to make the meetings like more effective and focused. And I would also say, once you've learned to do this, it's not something that you do only in the moment of the crisis, but keep that habit even afterwards, and learn to have that habit, build it up for the next crisis. As I said at the beginning, the moment to act for a crisis is before it happens.
Many organizations were taken by surprise when, at the beginning of this year, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. So how does one preempt such a risk and factor it into their project management planning?
So since we're talking about the crisis and things that cannot actually be foreseen, one model to look at this is the Cynefin framework. I presume you are familiar with Cynefin, but it has like these four quadrants where something is clear, complicated, complex, or chaotic. And in a crisis, you are in a situation of chaos. And what does the Cynefin framework say to do in that situation? It's to act and sense and respond. So there's not much thinking, so to say. It is try things out and see what happens. In the complex domain, you have another notion, which is to probe, sense, and respond. In the complicated, it's sense, analyze, and respond. In the obvious, it's sense, categorize, and respond. Now, notice one thing. Notice one thing. In all of these four cases, there is always an element of sensing and responding. You might do things before, after, or in between, and you do different things depending on which complexity domain you fall in. But isn't that interesting? That in all situations, no matter how challenging they are or how business as usual they are, you always have these two elements of sensing and responding. And I think that is the key to sort of generalize how to deal with these situations. As I said before, you cannot improvise something you have not prepared. So for the crisis, for the next crisis, you have to start working towards better ways of operating before it hits. But with this notion that there is always an element of sensing and responding, then like one mental model we can have is that we have to improve our senses to sense the collective senses of the organization. So I often say when you start using TameFlow, you are rewiring the let's say, nervous system of the corporation. You are making it more sensitive to be able to capture like the weak signals, so that you have leading signals of things that might come soon, and you can preempt, you can act sooner. But that also requires that the response is quicker. So in all these four domains of Cynefin, if we are supported by ways of working that put the organization in a better, equips the organization with better ways of sensing what is happening and is able to respond, so decision making quicker, then you will be more prepared even in the chaotic domain of the next crisis.
What do you see as the future for project managers?
Well, I have like mixed feelings and thoughts about this, because on the one side, project management will never go away, but as all things, the profession might need to evolve to change to the new circumstances. Some of these changes might be huge. We're talking about like artificial intelligence, decentralized autonomous organizations, big data, and all these computerized methods, approaches, tools can both take away a lot of burden from any work, even the work of project managers, but also pose new challenges. I mean, we have examples of companies that are putting AI in systems in order to make automatic decisions that up until today were taken by project managers. So there is a risk that the profession might, in certain situations, might become obsolete. We should not be surprised about technology overtaking humans. The electric bulb made all the candle makers go fishing because they had a lot of time on the clock. So we need to be prepared for this. But at the same time, if we are looking at the this world of evolving unpredictable situations, the role of project management, and I would say more generally of management, I think becomes that one of nurturing the unity of purpose, the community of trust, the self awareness, so that everyone becomes more attuned to what are the business outcomes that we want to achieve, and therefore it's worthwhile to learn about new concepts and notions which are not part of the conventional project management curricula. Now, the Project Management Institute with Disciplined Agile and Flex, with Scott Ambler and Al Shalloway, who are great friends of mine, they are doing an excellent job at like updating the project management profession with all the things we've learned in knowledge work in the last at least 20, if not 25 years. But I think also that that might not be entirely like covering the whole spectrum of skills and abilities that are necessary in this VUCA world. So that's where I invite everyone to take a look at the TameFlow approach, because it kind of starts where DA and Flex and SAFe and all the other agile approaches are ending. I have been developing these thoughts now for a long period of time, and the objective has always been that of creating these cohesive organizations where you have the unity of purpose, the community of trust, the inspired leadership. Oh, yes, I forgot to tell you what I mean with inspired leadership, because it's not inspiring. And this is the notion that not only a leader, but any person, any individual in an organization can be inspired because he or she has a purpose to take action and to show leadership. And this connects to the notion of decentralized decision making. If we are in a situation where people are allowed to make critical decisions, why? Because they are the ones that have the most current and actual knowledge and skills and ability to do so. Well, then what will drive those decision-making acts will be the purpose of the individuals. So they have to be inspired by something bigger. It is in this sense that TameFlow like transcends the conventional dimension of project management, but looks more at how can we make a whole organization into something that is bigger. And because we're building this on unity of purpose and community of trust, there is one other element I want to bring in. You probably know that in constraints management, activity constraints, we have that narrative, the metaphor of Herbie the scout walking through the woods and becoming overburdened and falling back. And then we have all the other Boy Scouts helping Herbie by carrying, sharing the carrying of his weight, and finally they make it to the base camp. So this is another important notion of this kind of superior performing organization. I say, like in the story of Herbie, they leave no one behind alone in the woods. So if some professional role is challenged because of the situation in the greater world, like COVID, creating a lot of crisis, or because the upcoming of new technologies like AI, blockchains, and so on, which might put some profession, when you put a question mark on the future of the profession. Well, these organizations will not fire people, but they will keep them on board and will find new ways for them to become important contributors in the pursuit of the company's goal. So, that's maybe what I would say to young project managers. Look at the bigger picture. Project management skills are excellent to learn, but there is more that can make your profession just so much more full of impact for these kinds of organizations.
That is actually my final question. What words of advice do you have to youngsters or who wish to take up a career in project management or a leadership role?
Yes, I am sure that any course in project management will give you the basic skills and abilities, so the drills to know the profession. But these institutions, like the Project Management Institute, they are large, so they take a long time to catch up with leading edge approaches. So my advice is, by all means, learn everything there is to learn in the conventional curricula. You will learn important things, but don't limit yourself to that. Learn even the new things, like the mental models of TameFlow, and learn even aspects which maybe are not so prominent in conventional project management courses. For instance, in TameFlow, by the way, I didn't mention, but TameFlow is called so because I manage 4 flows. One is the flow of operations, so what is typically the remit of project management. Second is the flow of finance, the generation of money. Third is the flow of information, and fourth is the psychological flow. So I was saying, for instance, in conventional project management, there is not a lot of attention given to psychological aspects. But if you want to build superior teams and superior organizations, then this psychological dimension is extremely important. So if you find ways to enhance project management techniques with elements that like trigger certain psychological behaviors which are conducive to that coherence, shared vision, unity of purpose, community of trust, well, then you will be a much better project manager.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing your wisdom and insights on all those questions. It was a real eye-opener for me, and I'm sure those watching this video will learn a lot from this. So thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.